Autora de um dos poucos livros a respeito de teatro na América Latina, e o que faz ela uma coisa bastante rara, porque na verdade nem nós brasileiros, nem argentinos, nem mexicanos costumam ser especialistas em teatro latino-americano. E como costuma acontecer, para bem ou para mal, há professores de universidades americanas que frequentemente conhecem o nosso trabalho melhor do que nós. Com vocês, Diana Taylor.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for inviting me here. I'm absolutely delighted to be in Brazil and to see so much interest in theater and performing arts. Basically, I want to tell you a couple of things about what I do before I start my presentation. I'm originally from Mexico, and my parents were Canadian, and I teach at a university in the United States. So a lot of my writing has to do with all of these perspectives, all of these positions, and how to negotiate between those borders. So I think you'll see that in my presentation today and then my presentation on Saturday. I'm also a person who studies performance studies, and I wanted to tell you just a little bit about that because it's different from theater studies. What we do in performance studies in New York at the university, at New York University, is look at, in a way, performance as an object, which means we look at theater, we look at dance, we look at rituals, we look at political things as well, demonstrations, we look at parades, all of those kinds of things. So in that sense, performance is an object of analysis. But what's a little bit different, and what I'd like to talk about a little with you, maybe now or in the question and answer period, is that we also use performance as a lens, as a methodology to look at a whole broad range of issues. So that some of the techniques, some of the hermeneutics, some of the things that people talk about when they talk about theater studies, we also apply to societies. So for example, those of you who do theater studies understand how important it is to look at the live in theater, not just the text, but the live. This is true of dance studies, obviously, too. You look at how you attract an audience's attention, how you get the audience to respond in certain ways. You look at the role of lighting, staging, choreography, all of those different things that capture the audience's attention, that conveys meaning, that gives a sense of conflict, or transmits a sense of resolution. But in performance studies, we look at societies in very much the same way, so that we think about not just drama, but we think about social dramas. We think about politics as very much a performance. We think of the way that social space is organized, the timing of events, the way that you capture an audience's attention, the way that you try to get the audience to do what you want the audience to do. So that it's not a case of theater being a metaphor for society, or it's not the other way around, that the stage is a world. It's trying to establish how society is in fact one system of representations, a very complicated system of representations, and theater is one of the many, many parts of it. And that the skills that we learn in theater also help us understand these other kinds of actions, because nobody else is really trained to read the live in the way that we're trained. So that it's a very urgent political issue to learn how to read the live. That's one thing. As a Latin Americanist, I also want to emphasize how important it is to think about performance and not just theater or not just dance. This is how I became involved in performance studies originally. Because whenever I read about theater in Latin America, I read about texts, I read about conventions that basically came with the conquest and with colonization. And when people talked about theater in Latin America, they basically referred to texts that looked like, you know, Western texts, European texts, and things like this. And I think that to focus on that is to miss the fact that there's a very broad range of performance practices in the Americas long before the period of the conquest and colonization. And these practices did not end with the conquest or colonization. In fact, many of those traditions continue, and that we, I think, should pay attention to them. So performance, I think, serves a very real need for us as Latin Americanists, but unfortunately we don't have a word for it in our languages. So I guess for now we have to keep saying performance. I don't know what else to do. So with that introduction, I'm going to start talking about my subject for today. I was asked to give two presentations, and I decided I would try to focus on two issues that I think are absolutely vital for Latin Americanists and Latin Americans. One of them is the one that I'm going to talk about today. The title of my paper today is Memory, Atrocity, and Representation. And it has to do with an issue that's an issue not just in Latin America, but what happens to countries when, or countries that have undergone civil violence, as in the case of, you know, Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, you know, Peru, and so forth, periods of very repressive military dictatorships. Chile, obviously, I mean. So what happens in those countries when the people who committed the violence did not get punished and did not go to jail? And what happens to the society that has to learn to live with that violence, with that memory of violence, and to artists especially who have to represent that violence? And what are the ethical and aesthetic issues around representation of violence, especially in theater, that I think pose very real challenges? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. On Saturday, I'm going to talk about, because of all of these impacts and interchanges of culture, about the theories and methods of cultural transmission that are also racial. So for example, one of the things I'll look at is mestizaje, which is a very important issue in parts of the Americas, and other theories of cultural transmission, such as transculturation. And these are important, again, in theater and in dance, because when you put a body on the stage, that body always has a race, and it always has a history.